I want to start with a claim so strange that if it came from anyone else, we could dismiss it in a sentence. In 1898, in downtown Manhattan, a man says he shook an entire city block. Buildings trembling, machinery jumping off the floor, police and ambulances converging on the neighborhood, and the device responsible, by his own account, was small enough to fit in the pocket of an overcoat. When the police arrived, he told his assistants to say nothing. He told the officers it must have been an earthquake. And then he said 7 words I haven't been able to put down since I first read them. That's all they ever knew about it. The man was Nikola Tesla, and here's why I can't dismiss the story in a sentence. The machine at the center of it is real. It has a patent number. It was demonstrated in public in front of the leading electrical scientists of the age. And 45 years after that night on Houston Street, within days of Tesla's death, agents of the United States government walked into a New York hotel and carried away every paper the man owned. Papers that would stay locked away for decades. So tonight, I want to follow this one machine, from a public stage in Chicago to a cracked building in Manhattan, to a sealed government file, and ask the question that sits at the end of that trail. When an invention disappears into a locked room, what happens to it in the dark? First, let me tell you where this story actually comes from, because that matters more than anything else in this episode. It comes from Tesla himself, July 10th, 1935, his 79th birthday. Every year, reporters climbed up to his suite at the Hotel New Yorker for what had become an annual ritual, the old inventor holding court, announcing things decades ahead of, or beyond, the science of his day. That year, he told them about Houston Street. He'd been experimenting with vibrations, he said, using one of his mechanical oscillators. He wanted to see if he could tune the machine to the natural vibration of the building, his laboratory at Houston Street, a structure of steel. So he turned it up, notch after notch. First, a peculiar cracking sound. His assistants couldn't find the source. A few more notches, louder cracking. He knew, he said, that he was approaching the resonant frequency of the steel frame itself. Then, in his words, suddenly all the heavy machinery in the place was flying around. He grabbed a hammer and broke the machine. The building, he claimed, would have come down around their ears in another few minutes. Outside, pandemonium, police, ambulances, and the inventor calmly instructing everyone to blame the ground itself. That's all they ever knew about it. Now, I need to be honest with you about this story, because honesty is the only thing that separates research from mythology. Tesla told it in 1935. The event supposedly happened in 1898, 37 years. No police report from 1898 has ever surfaced to confirm it. No newspaper account from that week describing tremors on Houston Street has been produced. By 1935, Tesla was an aging man with a genius's memory and a showman's instincts, and skeptics say this story is exactly what it looks like. A legend, polished for reporters by a man who loved an audience. That's a fair reading. It might even be the right one. But it runs into a problem, because the machine in the story is not a legend. The claim is his. The paper trail is real. Patent number US 514169, reciprocating engine. Granted February 6, 1894 to Nikola Tesla. You can read it tonight. Every patent from that era is digitized and public. And before the patent, there was a stage. On the evening of Friday, August 25, 1893, Tesla stood before the members of the Electrical Congress at the World's Fair in Chicago, introduced, the record notes, by Dr. Elisha Gray, one of the fathers of the telephone. This was not a seance for believers. This was the scientific establishment of the age, in the hall next to the agricultural building, watching a demonstration powered by an air compressor. What he showed them was, on its face, almost boring. A piston in a cylinder. No flywheel, no governor, no valves in the ordinary sense, just a piston bouncing between cushions of compressed air. Air springs, he called them. And because of a quirk in the physics of that arrangement, the vibration was isochronous, a technical word with a simple meaning: The rhythm never changes. Load it, unload it, vary the pressure, the stroke gets shorter or longer, but the beat stays fixed, like a pendulum that refuses to be hurried. The numbers from that evening survive. A weight of roughly 20 pounds vibrated 80 times per second on a stroke of 7/8 of an inch. Shorten the stroke and the same machine could run to hundreds of beats per second. 80 times a second in 1893. The stated purpose was entirely respectable, and I want to give it to you straight because it's the official record and it deserves fair treatment. Tesla built this machine to generate alternating current of perfectly constant frequency for precision work in his wireless research, a metronome of steel and air. Contemporary observers wrote that you could practically keep the time of day by it, like a clock. Thomas Comonford Martin, writing in Century magazine in April 1995, described it as an engine stripped to the skin, 1/30th the weight of a conventional engine of the same power, running on steam at 350 pounds of pressure with nothing superfluous left on it. A laboratory instrument, a better dynamo. That is the official story of this machine, and as far as it goes, it's true. But sitting in the record of that same Chicago lecture, there's a detail almost everyone reads past. Tesla, we're told, exhibited to the audience the pieces of a steel arbor, a solid steel shaft that had been torn apart while vibrating against the minute air cushion. Torn apart, solid steel, by vibration against air. He brought the broken pieces to the lecture. He wanted the most serious electrical scientists in the world to see them. And this detail has never stopped humming. Because a man who shows you a shattered steel shaft is not just demonstrating a clock, he is demonstrating what the clock can do to steel. And he knows it. 5 years later, by his own account, Houston Street cracked. If you're watching this and that broken steel shaft is doing to you what it did to me, if part of you is already searching for the patent or the Chicago lecture or the 1935 interviews, consider sharing this with someone who chases these threads the way you do. Almost every episode on this channel has been sharpened by leads that surfaced in the comments, archive links, forgotten publications, first-hand corrections. And this topic, more than most, is one where the documents are scattered and the searchers are few. Now, here's where the story stops being about a laboratory instrument, because the person who first suggested this machine could be a weapon was Tesla himself. At some point in those later years, a reporter asked Tesla the question a reporter will always ask: what would it take to destroy the Empire State Building? His answer, preserved in the press of the time, was not a denial, it was a recipe. Vibration, he said, will do anything. It would only be necessary to step up the vibrations of the machine to match the natural vibration of the building, and the building would come crashing down. And then he offered the homely proof everyone already knew. That's why soldiers break step when they cross a bridge. Read that again. The gentlest fact in physics, soldiers breaking step, offered as the operating manual for bringing down the tallest building on Earth. I'm not paraphrasing a critic of Tesla. I'm not quoting someone accusing him of anything. This is the inventor describing the destructive sealing of his own device on the record to the press. The leap from instrument to weapon was never made by fringe theorists. It was made first and publicly by the man who held the patent. And in that same 1935 birthday interview, the Houston Street interview, he went further. He announced what he called the art of telegydodynamics, a method, he claimed, of transmitting mechanical energy through the ground itself, accurately, with minimal loss over any terrestrial distance. Uses? Communication, and the unerring location of underground mineral deposits, reading the deep earth by its echoes, the way you find a wall stud by knocking. Energy, through the ground, any distance. His words, 1935. Mainstream engineering then and now is deeply skeptical that his small machines could deliver anything like this. Attenuation, scattering, the sheer dampening mass of the Earth. That skepticism is reasonable and you should hold on to it. But notice what happens to the shape of this technology across 4 decades of Tesla's own statements. 1893, a frequency standard; 1898, allegedly, a building nearly brought down by accident; 1935, energy through the Earth at any distance. The same idea growing quietly in one man's hands for 40 years. And that leaves a question the file never answers. Growing into what? We might have found out from his papers, which brings us to January 1943 and the part of the story that no one disputes because it was carried out by the government of the United States and recorded in its own files. Nikola Tesla died alone on January 7, 1943, in room 3327 of the Hotel New Yorker, the same hotel where, 8 years earlier, he had told the Houston street story. He was 86. He was, by then, largely dismissed, a relic, living on credit and pigeons and old glory. That's the context the official history gives us, and it's accurate, which makes what happened next very hard to explain. Within days of his death, representatives of the Federal Office of Alien Property entered his rooms and seized his estate, his notes, his letters, his devices, his research. Independent researchers who have traced the inventory put it at roughly 80 trunks of material, gathered from the hotel and from storage. 80 trunks. And here is the first anomaly, sitting right on the surface: the Office of Alien Property. Tesla was not an alien. He had been a naturalized citizen of the United States since 1891, for more than half a century. The agency, whose entire legal purpose was to seize enemy and foreign assets in wartime, took custody of the papers of an American citizen, and the official justifications on record are thin. His estate touched a foreign heir. The war created urgency. Procedures were flexible. Maybe. But you don't send that particular agency at that particular speed for a harmless old man's pigeon diaries. The government then did something that tells you exactly how seriously they took the relic. They sent a scientist to read everything. Dr. John G. Trump of MIT, one of the most respected electrical engineers in the country, spent days going through the seized material. His official conclusion, preserved in the declassified file, was that Tesla's papers were primarily speculative and philosophical in character, and did not include new workable principles or methods for realizing them. In short, nothing of significant military value. Nothing to see. That is the official verdict. I've given it to you word for word where it matters, and I want to treat it fairly. John Trump was a serious scientist, and it is entirely possible he was simply right. But then the record does something strange. If the papers were worthless, speculative, philosophical, militarily empty, the story should end in 1943 with a shrug. Instead, the file stayed active. The FBI's own dossier on Tesla, released to the public decades later through the Freedom of Information Act, you can read it today on the Bureau's own website, runs to hundreds of pages and shows interest in the fate of those papers continuing long after the nothing to see verdict was filed. The bulk of the estate wasn't released until 1952, when dozens of trunks were finally shipped to his nephew and ended up in the museum in Belgrade, where researchers who compare the numbers report that the count of containers seized in 1943 and the count that arrived in Belgrade have never quite been reconciled. 80 trunks taken, roughly 60 accounted for. The arithmetic has been argued about for 70 years, and I'll let you weigh those arguments yourself. So hold the sequence in your hands, because every link in it is a government record. And dismissed old man dies. Within days, the wrong agency seizes everything at wartime speed. An MIT expert declares it all worthless, and the worthless papers are then held for 9 more years, tracked in an intelligence file that takes half a century to reach the public, and released, by the count of independent researchers, incomplete. You do not guard an empty vault. The claim is his. The paper trail is real. I want to speak directly to you for a moment, because this is the point in a story like this, where a narrator can either respect you or use you. I am not claiming an earthquake machine exists. I am not claiming Tesla's oscillator was developed into one. And I want to be completely unambiguous about something. Nothing in this episode is about any earthquake anywhere in our time. Real seismic tragedy takes real lives. And the record we've examined tonight, a patent, a lecture, an interview, a file, says nothing whatsoever about any modern event. Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you certainty they do not have. That's not a theory I'm dancing around. It's a line I won't cross. Here is what I am claiming, and it's narrower and, I think, harder to dismiss. First, the machine was real, public, and patented, and its inventor, personally, publicly described its destructive potential. Second, the government of the United States treated that inventor's papers, after officially declaring them worthless, with a speed, a secrecy, and a duration of custody that the official explanation does not adequately cover. Those two facts are not a conspiracy. They are the documented behavior of institutions on the record. And documented behavior is allowed to raise a documented question. When a technology is dismissed in public and held in private, which of the two is the real assessment? Because there's one more document, and it's the one I can't file away. April 28, 1997. A Department of Defense press briefing. Official, transcribed, on the public record to this day. The Secretary of Defense of the United States, William Cohen, is speaking about future threats, and in the middle of describing what hostile actors might one day attempt, he refers to the possibility of setting off, his words, earthquakes, volcanoes, remotely through the use of electromagnetic waves. Let me be precise about the context, because precision is what separates this channel from the noise. Cohen was not announcing an American weapon. He was describing threats attributed to others, capabilities discussed, feared, theorized. Read the whole transcript. It's public. But sit with the date. 59 years after a man in Manhattan claimed he cracked a building with a pocket-sized oscillator and told the police it was an earthquake. 53 years after that man's papers vanished into federal custody under a verdict of nothing of value. And here is the highest defense official in the most powerful country on earth in a briefing room treating the remote triggering of earthquakes not as fantasy, but as a threat category worth naming to the press. Somewhere between 1943 and 1997, the idea Tesla described stopped being an old man's birthday story and became something a Secretary of Defense says out loud. I don't know what happened to it in those 54 years. That's the honest answer. The file that would tell us is exactly the kind of file that doesn't reach the reading room. So let me leave you where the trail leaves me. The question is not whether the machine existed. There's a patent, and a stage in Chicago, and a broken steel shaft passed around a lecture hall. Not whether Tesla made the claim. The interviews are on record, told to a room full of reporters. Not whether the papers were taken. The government's own file says so, with a case number. The question, the only one left standing, is what an idea becomes during 50 years in a locked room. Who read those trunks in the years we weren't allowed to read? What did they underline? And when the machine's own inventor tells you it could bring down the tallest building on Earth, and the men who took his notes tell you there was nothing there, whose word exactly are we taking? Tesla told his assistants to say nothing. He told the police it was an earthquake. That's all they ever knew about it, he said. And he sounded almost proud. The uncomfortable thought I can't shake is that the sentence might not describe 1898. It might describe us. Find me the file that proves it doesn't. The complete one. Every trunk, every page. I'll be here, listening.